Go ahead. So let me introduce myself again. My name is Mike Lloyd. I'm a master gardener for our county. My wife, Cindy, she's another master gardener. And Jody is here. She's a third master gardener. So we're almost outnumbering the audience, but we hope that you guys, our job is to prepare and to share information about gardening. And we're part of the UGA Extension volunteer program, and we're master gardeners for this county. So this presentation was kind of a long time coming. We had hoped to give it a month ago, which would have afforded everybody more time to do preps, but there's still lots of time to do preparations for the spring garden. So Kevin Alpha and I, Kevin has been called away, so I'm it. But so you have to deal with me, but Kevin was called away. We were supposed to co-do this presentation, but he was called away on personal business. So I have to pretty much carry the load. So anyways, so the presentation is on fall preparations for the spring garden. So Cindy, next slide. Okay, we have a little technical difficulty. And then it should work. So I was thinking, well, in preparing this presentation, what kind of gardens people have. And regardless of whether you have an existing garden or a garden that you plan to do, or you want to expand a garden, there's lots of things to consider and what to do. And fall is a great time to start thinking about it. There's a lot of time available to do everything you might want to do. Get your garden the way you want it, and to plan and put things in it the way you'd like. And getting ready, next slide. Yeah. Okay, in getting your garden ready, there's some basic questions that you need to ask yourself. And in addition to that, once you decide answering those basic questions, you want to plan the garden accordingly, select the site, and obviously prepare the soil. Now, whether you put in a garden that's in the ground or a raised bed, same sort of question. So it really applies to everyone, any type of garden, even if it's just one tomato or one pepper, you still want to do the basic same things. So it's applicable. So the next slide, there's some basic questions that you want to ask. Is this a new or expanded or an existing garden? And where are you going to put it? I already asked that question. How large it is going to be, and what are you going to put in it? Now, in this pictures here, I show this one garden. It's a kind of a series of shots of the same garden over different periods of time. And you can see in January, nothing's happening. April, things are starting. July, things are popping. And by October, things are kind of dying back. One thing that I want to show in this series of pictures, is that our garden is a changing thing. It's not static. So when you think about a garden and plan for it, you want to plan for what's going to be in there, how big it's going to get, and whether it's something that's going to be annual or perennial, that sort of questions. And the next slide. So the gardening plan you want to put together there's very important things you want to consider. And so I tried to emphasize, with my icon here, that these are what you really want to look at. One of the things that you want to consider is the size. How many hours of sunlight you get, the soil, the slope, the drainage, water sources, how far the garden is from your house, wildlife, and there's some other factors. And so in the next slide, we'll talk about the size. A garden is as big as you need it to be. And if you look at what you're going to do with this garden, if you plan just to eat fresh food from the garden, it won't have to be that big, because tomatoes or peppers, you pick them as you come. If you plan to freeze your vegetables or whatever, you want more. So you want a bigger garden. So here how what you plan to do affects the size of the garden. Now, if you plan to sell stuff at produce at a market, farmer's market, much bigger. But my one rule of thumb is that if you're a beginner gardener, you're best to start small and grow your garden. And what I mean by that is grow the size of your garden. So it's important because what happens so often, and I've seen this time and again, is that people have these grandiose plans and they plow a whole field up with a tractor. They plant whatever, corn, whatever they plant. And guess what? They lose, it's just too much work and everything goes to weeds. Animals get in it. They get nothing out of it. And so they wasted their time and they get frustrated. So to avoid all that and to have some fun growing, really try to start small and then work from there. Because if it's not fun and you're not getting a lot out of it, you're gonna lose interest. So maintaining that interest is important, and getting something out of the garden to pay back all the work is very important. So I think besides the size, the most important factor in a garden success is sunshine. You gotta have it. And most vegetables require full day. You can't do without 6 to 8 hours of sun. So whatever vegetable you pick, tomatoes, peppers, corn, squash, you want to plan on a spot that's got a lot of sun. Now, there are vegetables that don't require a lot of sun. Mostly it's the lettuces and cabbage type plants, which can be grown in the winter when the sun is low and fewer hours of daylight. But for the most part, you really need to consider sun, how much there is. The next important thing is soil. Vegetables really prefer soil that has a lot of humus in it. And I would use the term organic, but people use that for different things. And humus is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about having a soil that is very friable. That is, it's soft. Roots can penetrate very well through that kind of a soil. One of the things that I wanted to point out is that if you're planting a garden, even if you have one, you want to reduce competition from tree roots. It's amazing. My first garden, one of my first gardens, we were 30 feet from a maple tree, and we had maple tree roots in the garden. So we plowed them out. But those kind of things do come in. A garden we had in Arkansas, we had fig tree. Fig trees are notorious for having very long roots. And every year I would have to plow right next to where the fig tree was. And every year they grew back into the garden. But tree root competition will really reduce the production you have from the garden. And another thing, and around here we have a lot of that, rocky and clay soils. You want to work on that, and adding humus will really help reduce the impact of those constituents in the soil. Another aspect that's important, and people, you've probably heard about around pH, soil pH. And I'll talk a little bit about what it is and why it's important. And also fertility of the soil, what nutrients are there are important. And one way to kind of get an idea of what you're dealing with in a soil is to have a soil test done. And you could do it yourself to some extent, and you could use get it tested by a UGA lab or one of the other facilities. But it is important, and it's especially important for new and expanding gardens where you don't know what you're dealing with necessarily. So and you haven't added any amendments. And the soil test, I just want to kind of get into that a little bit. It's really the best way to test, to check the pH of the soil and how fertile it is. It's easy to do a pH test with a hand tester. I have one that I just stick it in the ground. It's got a couple of probes on it. The soil has to be damp for it to work, but it gives you an idea. It doesn't have to be super accurate. You want to know, pH within ±1 is probably good enough for most plants. Unfortunately, these hand testing devices don't do a good job of fertility. And so a test that like you have at UGA is really the better way to do it. They are $10, I think, nowadays, and they will ensure you start off at a good spot from a soil pH and fertility perspective for what you want to put in. So if you do this test, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on how to do it. It's simple. In your garden spot, you pick 10 randomly selected spots. You dig down like the shovel is showing, down deep, 6 to 8 inches, 6 to 10 inches, and you get a slice of soil, and you take that slice and you put it in a bucket, and you dry it, mix it, and then you can send that off to the lab. And these little bags they give you. And what the lab will do is give you the pH of the soil, and they'll tell you what the nutrients are. And if you tell them what you plan to plant, like tomatoes, peppers, or whatever, they'll tell you what you need to do to the soil to make it perfect for those plants. And it stays good for a while. pH can change over time. Fertility to some extent, but pH can change. And so having a hand meter is nice to have too. And periodically do this every 5 years or whatever, whenever you especially make any changes to your garden. So let's talk a little bit about soil pH. So we're getting into chemistry now, one of my favorite subjects. So soil pH is a measure of the acidity or alkalinity of the soil. And it goes from a scale from 0, which is very acidic. It would melt through glass if it were that acidic, or 10, which is very alkaline. And 7 is neutral. So in the middle ground, 7 is a neutral point. Now, most of our soils in Georgia are slightly acidic, but in our particular area, we have a lot of limestone. So you get more alkaline soil. And in my yard, I found, because of the limestone, we live near ball ground, it was actually a pH that was on the alkaline side, which isn't the best for plants. So what I'm showing on this chart here is what plants like. And this is the range that they prefer, this green band. And these are the various nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the main 3 you typically hear of. But then there's a lot of micronutrients. But the availability of those nutrients changes with pH. So if you make it more acidic, for example, which would go this way, you may lose some of these micronutrients availability. And even some of the nutrients like phosphorus is only good in this one range. So you want to make sure that your soil pH is about where you want it to be for the plants you're putting in. Very important. And that will be something you get out of either your own personal device looking at pH, or have the soil tested. Now, soil fertility is what's in the soil, what elements are there. The big 3 always talk about is NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And if you go to a big box store and you see the 3 numbers on it, typically 10, 10, 10 means it's got 10% available nitrogen, 10% available phosphorus, and 10% available potassium by weight, essentially. So you put this in the soil, it's going to give you what's known as a balanced fertilization. So putting in these 3 elements. Now, there are a lot of other micronutrients that you could add, and some fertilizers do give you that, those micronutrients, and they tell you what it is. But those are the big 3, and if you kind of manage those, you'll probably be better off for the most part. The nitrogen, I would back up a little bit before we move. Nitrogen is a very tenuous thing. It comes and goes. So the soil test won't typically tell you nitrogen, but you want to have it in there when they start growing, but it's used up and it's completely gone by the end of the season. So bear that in mind, that nitrogen is very, you might call it volatile or very changeable in the course of a season. Now, soil texture in the next slide is a very important element I already touched on. And the soil needs to have air in it and to hold moisture. And organic or humus material like compost is really good because it provides like little highways for the roots to travel in the soil, so they can reach these nutrients in water that's stuck in the soil. So if you step on soil, it will compress it, and that makes it less likely for the roots to have access to a certain area that's been compressed. So when you make your garden, you try to aerate it and then make your walkways and walk only on the walkways. Don't walk where the plants are, because that's going to compress the soil in that area. So you're trying to avoid compacting the soil by putting rows in, or some feature. If you have a raised bed, you don't want to step in the raised bed. Now, for the soil, obviously we're concerned about the health of the soil and retaining it. So it's a good idea to add a fall crop, like a cover crop of winter clover or something like that. And it does a couple of things. Clover in particular can set nitrogen in the soil by its roots. It will create these pathways for the roots for your summer vegetables to follow. And so it will improve the overall fertility of the soil. And I think you'll have a better garden for it. Now, you can do other things to prevent erosion, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. So soil amendments. One of the big amendments based on pH is lime, and that will typically raise the pH, makes it more alkaline. Sulfur will lower it. So for example, in my blueberry bed I talked about earlier, I had a pH that was too high. Blueberries love acid. I had way too much alkaline soil because of the limestone. I add sulfur. One thing about adding these elements, lime or sulfur, is that it takes time for them to become incorporated. There's a chemical reaction in the soil with basically like for example, the sulfur is digested by biological living species in the soil, converted to sulfuric acid, which makes it more acidic. So it takes time. It takes time for these processes to work. So putting them in now in advance is one of the big advantages about thinking about a garden now rather than waiting in the spring, because you've already been able to address these issues sooner. So it just takes time. Let's see. And if you were to add amendments, the finer ground those amendments are, like if you added lime, the finer ground they are, the quicker they'll react, because there's more surface area for the little particles. Adding organic material, and I'm really talking about humus compost, is also a good thing. And I'll diverge a little bit on adding organics. You can buy in a big box store like black cow manure. That's perfectly fine, and it's good, and you should add that type of material. But if you go to someone who has horses, for example, and get manure, two things about the manure: you want it rotted, because fresh manure can actually burn the plant roots. So you want to rot it, let it sit in the pile, turn the pile, let air get to it. Whole nother presentation about composting, but you want to compost it to where it's basically no longer got all those concentrations of salts in the manure. And the other thing about manure, horse manure, is that it can contain chemicals that people use to spray weed for weed control in the fields. And that can kill your plants next summer because it passes through the guts of the horses in their poop, and that's what you're putting in the soil, and that poop will then have those chemicals. So if you do get a source of manure, which I think if you can, I'm a dirty old man, so I love dirt and I love manure. So I think it a good idea to test that. Put a plant in it, see if the plant dies after you compost it. If it dies, you know that's not good to put in your garden. But if it lives, you know it's okay. So that's your own little self-made test to check your manure quality, see if it does have some bad chemicals in it. So another thing to consider, and these I just put others because these are all just other factors, is the slope. Because we don't have much choice on where we live and where we want to put the garden sometimes. But a slight slope is really a good thing for a garden because it allows for drainage. It's also, depending on the steepness of the slope, you could get into erosion issues. So erosion is something that none of us wants because when it happens, your soil just washed down the drain and all the effort you spent building it up with whatever you put in it is gone. It's down the stream and it's a waste of time. But it's also a bad thing for the environment. So now if you do have a steep slope, you can terrace, and I've done a lot of that in my yard. So I built stone walls, retaining walls, lots of work, lots of front end work, but it will make for a better garden if you want to put a garden in a spot that would normally be not suitable. You can use containers or something like that, or even terrace it with raised beds. That's also an option. But the idea is to hold the soil in place so that you don't have this runoff. A south-facing slope, again, we don't have much choice sometimes, but a south-facing slope is always preferred to a north-facing slope in the northern hemisphere. Say the same, I would say just the opposite in New Zealand, but here the sun is mostly in the south, even in the summer. So you'll get more sunshine. If it's facing to the north, it's much more oblique angle. Even in the summer, it will get less sun and it will be less productive. Another aspect I mentioned earlier is water. Sooner or later, we'll have a drought. Last summer was a great summer. Previous summer was a great summer for rain. The previous to that, we had a horrible drought here, and it was devastating to the point where, if you wanted the garden, you had to water it. Now, what I did is I collect water from my roof and put it in IBCs, big, like 500 gallons. So it helps me some. And I'm not recommending you do that as a beginner, but if you do have a slope, you could use it if you wanted to collect it and use it that way, and it saves some water price, because the cost of watering a vegetable, you wonder, is it worth doing it? But if you have good soil, good organic humus soil, you'll have to water less. So it's another reason to have that organic material in your soil. It will hold more water at the end, if you don't mind. Okay. For this reason, if you have water spigot, you might want to put it the garden close to the house. But having a garden close to your house has some big advantages. Not only is it easy to harvest, Cindy will say, "Oh, honey, go out and get some chives, or go out and get some parsley, or get this or that," and it's like right there we can get it. But if you walk way down the hill from my back door, it's a bigger, more of a chore. So you're more likely to get an easier harvest. But also, and I see this, and I've seen it in my personal life, is that you really want to see what's going on in your garden. Things happen. The bugs get in, or you might have a disease, or wildlife may cause some problems. You want to know very quickly so you can jump on that issue and solve it before it becomes a devastation for your garden. So having a garden close to your house is good. Now, we don't have wind issues here, but wind is another factor. If you or on the top of a hill, it can do damage to taller plants like corn, for example, and it can definitely dry your soil. So it's something that should be considered depending on where your property or where your garden is actually located. And moving along with other factors, cannot forget wildlife. Wildlife can be so frustrating and devastating to a garden. It's amazing, and deer can come in and eat everything you have in days. Bunnies can eat all your newly planted plants. Frustrating as all get up. And some simple fencing is probably a good idea. Depends on what you want and how much you're willing to spend on the fence. And I'll be honest, I found that like raccoons love sweet corn. It's like a magnet to a raccoon. So what I found is a simple chicken wire fence works well, 4 foot, 3 foot, even so, with an electric wire on top. But hey, I'm a proponent. Once someone touches that electric wire, they never come back. Of course, it's happened to me too. So I did come back even after I got shot. But I do want to caution you about wildlife. Now, so we talked about all the factors associated with planting a garden. Let's get down to some details about the plan. And remember, this works too, even if you have a garden and you want to expand it, but it also, some things in here I'll talk about you want to consider, even if you have a garden and you don't plan to expand it. So the first thing is kind of draw a map of how you want to put things. Now, this is a pretty extensive looking garden, but even a small garden, you want an idea of how you want to plant it. So, show roughly the lengths, the widths, and you'll know about how many, with proper plant spacing, you'll know how much you can produce in that garden. So especially a new garden, you do want to know if I want, so many tomatoes, if I want to make, what we do, freeze the tomatoes and make sauce out of them. You want so many. So it will also allow one thing, if you draw a map like this, it shows your access. Access to the plants is critical. If you put all your plants in one big spot and no room for walking, not only will it be too crowded, but you won't be able to harvest that well. So it's important to have access. And access also, these walkways provide a lot of air flow, which is good for the plant health. And it also provides more sun for the plants themselves. So it's good to have a plan. When you put a plan like this together, you want to look at where your water sources are, because you want to, if you have a hose bib or something along here, you can make it so that it'd be easy to hose. And I put irrigation piping in. I mentioned earlier, I have a big IBCs and I pipe it. I'm an engineer, so bear with me, but I pipe it underground to my garden and I have a spigot in the garden. I drain it in the winter, but I then irrigate. I have pipes, PVC pipes that run in each of these beds, and I just have to open a valve up and it just runs, the water runs into it without wetting the leaves. Another presentation, how to keep good, healthy plants, but you don't want to wet the leaves. So that's, something important is where your water is. And you want to, another thing you want to consider is the height of the plant. Some plants are going to be super tall, some are going to be very short, and you don't want the tall ones shading the shorter ones if you can avoid it. Now, seed packets kind of tell you how big the plant's going to get and so on. Typically, you'll put the taller ones on the north side. And again, I caution you, don't plant more than you can eat, because you end up, you'll lose interest in the garden. You'll have more weeds than produce. So garden plan. So one of the things that are useful, even if you have an existing garden, is the idea of crop rotation. Now, you probably have heard the term batted around, but basically it's putting in a series of years, putting dissimilar plants in the same area in different seasons. So for example, And why? Well, so I'll give you an example on the next slide. But so the purpose of rotating a crop is to maintain fertility of the soil, to reduce disease. Major benefit. So if you have a disease in an area and you put peppers, the next year you put peppers over here, they won't see the diseased soil. And the next year they may see some problem because they had some potential disease. You move it into the third area. You keep moving the plants ahead of the disease. And by the fourth year, you can move it back to the fifth year, you can move it back to area one. The disease had been reduced. And it will also help reduce weeds. So this next slide shows you a crop rotation program that Josh Fruger, he's our UGA County Extension agent, put together in one of his slides presentation. And here you see that in area one, he planted in the summer corn. The next, this is in year one. In year two, he planted corn in area two. In year three, he planted corn in area three. In year four, he planted corn in area four. So he's moving these crops around. In the fifth year, he moves corn back here. So the corn is staying ahead of the diseases and insects that are embedded in the ground. So that's a very tricky thing. If you can do it, it's advisable. I have a pepper disease called black leaf mold, and it's a bad one. And I love peppers. So from Louisiana, we were talking about that before the session. And so I really do try to keep the peppers ahead of the disease, and it helps. It really does help. So the next slide shows you gardening equipment. And if you're a new gardener, you need to start acquiring this. You have time. Now, Christmas season, maybe you could put that in your wish list. But you need gloves, hats, obviously hand tools, shovels, maybe digging forks, rakes, hoses, nozzles, wheelbarrows. My favorite device. I think my neighbor thinks that's all I do around my area is to push wheelbarrows, and I think he's probably right. You have markers for the rows, and if you can, a rototiller. And I actually have a little mantis like this, but I have a bigger one. Now, some in a new way of thinking, people say you don't need a no-till garden. It's okay. I'm not saying you have to. There's ways of avoiding tilling, but in my way of thinking, I'm an old-fashioned guy, and I like the tilling because I think I mix the soil up and I can mix the fertilizers and all that stuff in there a lot better. But anyways, since we're in fall, hey, you want to winterize. If you have your equipment already, have an existing garden, you want to prepare for winter. You could roll the hoses up. We got time. So first freeze is probably Saturday night. And clean and sharpen your tools and all that kind of stuff. Change your oil in your tillers if you have it. Grease the axles and so on. If you have wooden handles for tools, I use tung oil, and I do that in the winter. I just treat the handles, all the wood surfaces with tung oil. You can buy that at a big box store. A little bit pricey, but it goes a long way, and it will protect your tools. It's not quite paint, it's an oil that penetrates. So now we want to talk a little bit about preparation of the soil. We talked about the soil sample already. So at this point, we can start clearing. We know where we're going to put the garden. We have a basic plan. We can start clearing the area. It may be a grass, a weedy area. It might even be trees or shrubs, whatever. But you want to take out what you plan to take out and prepare your soil. If you've had a soil test run, you can start adjusting the pH. You can add organic matter, as we discussed, black cow, whatever, something like that. You can add fertilizer. Now, I will say about fertilizer is that earlier I said nitrogen is a tenuous element, and it's going to change. So if you added nitrogen now, it will not be there in the spring. So you can wait on the nitrogen, and you can wait on the fertilizer for the most part. If you're adding 10-10-10, you can wait till then. Now, if you put in a cover crop like winter clover, you could put that in, but then you want to add maybe an inoculant to get it to make more nitrogen in its roots. Till it, and if you plan to put a fence in, go ahead and do your fence. Lots of time now to do it. So the mulch and the cover crop I kind of alluded to is that, I typically use mulch because it's easy, but and it's protecting the soil that I mentioned earlier. I use pine straw. You can use wheat straw. Don't use hay. Hay has a lot of weed seeds in it, and so if you want weeds, you can put hay in. It's just horrible. But if you try to improve the soil fertility, you can put a cover crop. And there's different formulas. You can go on UGA's webpage or others and what they recommend. And it's usually typically a legume with a cereal, a mix. But even if it's just a legume, that would be like a clover, that would still be good. But you could add an inoculant to it to make it more effective. So and it does help and at the springtime, you till all that in, you got more fertility, more organic matter in the soil. So other things you can do, we talked about fencing, and you can start thinking about irrigation. And I don't put the irrigation in the winter, but I make sure that I'm thinking about it and have all the irrigation prepared or bought and where you want to put it. I use PVC pipes in my irrigation system, and I punch a hole, I think a small hole every 3 inches and a little valve turn off, and it works for me. It's really cheap and it's durable because some of this tape, the rolls you see, the drip tape, they don't last but maybe a season or 2, and they get brittle. One crack in that, it's gone. So you toss it out, more landfill. So we can start, we got plenty of time, and this is the fun part. Start thinking about seeds and plants. Now, if you're a beginner garden, for the most part, you want to try to buy plants rather than seeds because it's a big process growing seeds. But some plants do best from seed, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Some do best from, putting the seeds in early in the spring and growing them, or buying plants. So direct sowed versus buying plants. And you might have a mix if you're a gardener. I typically grow all my own seeds from all my plants from seeds, and then give away what I have excess. But if you do buy seeds, try to get them from a quality supplier. You can go to a big box store and buy Burpee seeds or other, name brand seeds, and they're going to be what they say they are. If you collect seeds from a garden, like pepper seeds, they may not be what the plant parent was because they hybridize in a garden. Corn, for example, if you get corn, a nice ear of corn, and you say, oh, this is really great corn, and then try to grow it from those corn kernels, it won't be the same product. So you want to start with good seeds that they're going to grow what they describe to be. So a good quality source and you want to try to find disease-resistant varieties, because eventually, maybe not be the first year, but eventually diseases will show up, just like the insects show up in your garden. When a cabbage loopworm will show up in your cabbage and you wonder where it came from. Well, they find it. So we talked a little bit about planting indoors versus purchasing. And again, the beginner probably really should do more of the purchasing plants in a smaller garden. As the garden grows, then it becomes more of a burden to buy, financial burden to buy the plants. And you can start thinking about starting them from seed. And there is a presentation. In fact, I did it in January, a webinar, which I'll talk about at the end, that you can go to resource of how to do some of these things, like grow your own seeds. So I mentioned earlier, what kind of seeds, some seeds are best to direct sow, and they're beans, peas, corn, okra, tend to be bigger seeds. Leafy vegetables, easy, that you kind of sprinkle on the surface, radish, beets, and root crops. They tend to be easy to better direct sow. Some seeds, they're very slow. They require warm soil. and it takes a while before the soil is warm enough, and then you don't get the full crop because you're weighted. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, those kind of things, you're probably better off buying the seeds. Now, some things like sweet potatoes, you're better off buying the roots, not seeds or not plants. There'd be rooted cuttings. So knowing the difference between, which plants you want to buy seeds for, and which plants you want to buy plants for is important. I've gone to Walmart or Lowe's, and I've seen people, it's like a plant, like a corn plant. Really, I mean, to buy a corn plant, it's better to plant the corn with seeds. So kind of know what ones you should buy and put in directly as opposed to putting them in plants. So if you're going to put the seeds in, you want to start early in the year. If you're going to buy them, you can start a little bit later, because there'll be a long time to get them to start if you put them under lights into your home. And as we get closer to spring, you want to do those final preps I talked about: tilling in the mulch, fertilizing, tilling in the cover plants, installing your irrigation. And that's a spring chore for me every year. And it's that you're trying to find when it's a little dry enough to work out there, warm enough, because I'm a heat loving person. So I'm always trying to find those best days to work out there. But this is something you can wait until closer to where you're actually starting to think about planting. And then follow your plan. Try to follow your plan that you put in earlier for your garden. And in the growing season, there's always lots to do. That's a whole different subject, so we're not going to touch that today. But there are definitely webinars that you can follow. We've produced, I've been heavily involved in producing some of these webinars. One of them is successful vegetable gardening, and it would kind of tell you a lot more about the growing season itself. Some of these presentations I mentioned, you can get by going to, on your browser, searching UGA extension Cherokee County YouTube or something like that, and clicking on the YouTube channel for UGA extension, and then go to videos, and you'll find all those. Or you go directly here, but I don't think anybody on God's green earth would ever remember that string of characters. So hopefully we'll get this recorded and it will be placed on this webinar, this channel. But getting there, you need to, I guess, maybe eventually go to your browser. There's a lot of different presentations. One seed starting I talked about successful vegetable gardening, fall gardening in containers. We tried to focus on container gardening. And the next slide, this is what you'll see when you pull up that YouTube channel. You'll see all of these presentations, and it's just a large number of them, and there are various topics. We didn't cover just vegetable gardening. We're talking about everything: pruning, making your curb appeal on your house, pollinators. I mean, you name it. Snakes. We tried to cover some topics. Hopefully, if you have a chance to look at this, we could share our knowledge with you in that regard. So this is near the end of the presentation. I want to wish you guys a happy gardening. I hope this helped. And it's more of an introduction, but I hope it helped you to be a better gardener and to do more production from it and have more fun in the long run. So that pretty much concludes my presentation. I do have a slide following this. It's from references. And if this does get posted, you'll be able to go back to those references. But there's lots more references you can look up. UGA Extension does a lot of work, and that's what they're designed to do. They are our, if you would, consultants at the university who share research-based knowledge with us as gardeners. And thank you for coming. I certainly enjoyed it. I'm going to stop the recording here in just a minute, and then I'll entertain questions.